This is a really a unique opportunity to get in front of all of the product people. Is just, well, it's rare, first of all, and I don't want to waste even a minute of it, which is why it would be good to see some slides. There we go. So, there we go. I wanted to talk, I actually feel very strongly about what I want to talk about today, and I'm going to sort of break all my rules, like Mina just finished up with the 3 key points. I added them up, and there's like 74 key points I want to make in the next minutes. But I'm going to throw a lot at you, but so I spend almost all my time working with companies, mostly startups, but some companies get to the IPO stage, growth stage, scale. There is a tremendous difference, I find, constantly between how most companies work and how the best companies work. Most product teams, the best product teams. That drives me nuts. I think as an industry, we don't do a good enough job sharing. And this is one of the reasons I'm so happy to have this opportunity in front of you, is to try to share. Now, I'm going to try to shine a light on what I believe are the root causes of why so many product efforts fail. And we shouldn't kid ourselves. The vast majority of product efforts fail. For every Uber, for every Airbnb, there's thousands of failed companies. And even within an Uber or a Facebook or a Google, we heard, for every AdWords, there's many Google Glasses or things that struggle and have a hard time. So even within a great company, there's a lot of challenges. And this bothers me. I think we can have a much better track record. But I will say I'm gonna try to be pretty blunt in this. What my plan is to do this. It's to start by shine a light on how I think, despite whatever nomenclature you might have, despite whatever sort of agilistas you might have in your company that have a very strong on what they think you're doing, I want to try to describe what I would bet money the vast majority in this room are actually doing, okay, on how you actually work. So I want to start by doing that, and I'll try to not editorialize. I'll try to just sum it up quick. And then I'm going to go through the 10 biggest reasons why that way of working is so fundamentally flawed. And that's where I'm going to spend the heart of the time, because to me, what matters here, the big opportunity, is to have you connect the dots about why the way you work has so many fundamental problems. And then just to not leave you completely depressed at the end of today, I'm going to give you a glimpse into how the best companies work, best teams work. Now, I actually know a good number of the teams in the room, and I can tell you for a fact that there are several companies, several teams in the room, or people in the room that are working not like I'm about to describe. They're working like the way I'll finish up with, as a great team. But the vast majority, I'll lay money, and you guys can you can let me know, or you can decide for yourself how close this is to how your team works. Now, the other thing I'd say is, even if you're a company that doesn't have these sort of flawed ways of working, if you grow, if you kind of get that product market fit and you kind of get growing, is a really common problem that the company sort of backslides into this way of working as the company grows. It happens all the time. We'll know a great startup, and I bet you guys have heard this. I hear it all the time. I'm introduced to a CEO, usually from a VC. They'll say, when we just were going early, we were experimenting constantly, we were learning fast, we were growing, and then we kind of reached this point, and it's like, I feel like we can't innovate anymore. I hear that all the time. We can't innovate anymore. And the other thing they say is, and it takes us forever to get an idea live. You guys have all heard this. And this is because the way they're working now is not like the way they worked when they were an actual startup. There's some legitimate reasons for that. There's also a whole lot of bogus reasons for that. And I want to really highlight. So even if you're not one of those teams in the majority, I think you'll want to know so that you don't fall into these traps. I can just skip the time here and go into this. Let me just, again, I'm going to summarize how I think most teams work. All right, first point, everything starts with ideas. It is true that a lot of companies like to pretend things start with something like a lean canvas, but the truth is it starts with ideas, and then we sort of reverse engineer the canvas. But the idea is we start with ideas. Now, there's two main sources in most companies of ideas. There's the executives, the business owners, the stakeholders, whatever you'd like to call that group of highly paid people. And then there's the customers. If it's a B2B company, it's usually big customers. If it's a B2C company, it might be a little bit from customers. It might be advertisers or other kinds of partners. But those are the two main sources. And two main sources of ideas. Now, most companies, their big goal is to make a roadmap. They usually do them on a quarterly basis, sometimes monthly, sometimes annual, but one way or another, they want to come up with a roadmap, which of course, there's lots of flavors of roadmaps, but basically we're talking a prioritized list of features and projects. What are you going to do this quarter? Now, in order to do that roadmap, they need to do some kind of business case. Now, I have it in quotes because most companies today don't do a formal business case. They're informal. You guys have all seen the sessions. Many of you probably spend a significant portion of your time managing the product roadmap for your product. But basically, it's not crazy why people want these roadmaps. There's really two big reasons. The first one is they want to know that you're working on the highest value things first. You've all heard the concept of business value. And then the other reason, usually even the bigger reason, is they want to have some level of predictability in the business. They want to know what's going to happen this quarter so they can run the business. And those are not insane reasons. Now, in order to know what you should put on that roadmap and what the priority is, they do some form of business case. Now, business cases really are based on two things. They're not actually, even if you do a formal one, they're not complicated. There's two main inputs. How much money you think you're going to make, or how much value do you think you're going to create, and how much is it going to cost, or level of effort, whatever term you guys use. So anyway, they'll do that business case they don't do it for every little feature or little bug certainly, but they do it for typically features and bigger projects and initiatives. And anyway, they come up with a roadmap. Next, eventually something makes it to the top of the roadmap. It's time to work on something. And this is where you usually enter the picture. Some product manager will be assigned, or it's for the team, so the product manager will picking these words carefully, gather up the requirements and document them for the engineers. Or if you have a UX team, which we hope you do, but then giving this sort of description of what needs to be built, it may be as simple as user stories, to the designers, interaction designers, visual designers, giving them to the UX team. The UX team, of course, will take that and come up with a design. They'll come up with an experience, and that's sort of the other half of what has to be described. And eventually that will make it to some developers. And the developers will, of course, build that out. Now, that's usually where Agile comes into the picture. So this is showing that, maybe it takes 3 sprints or 2 sprints to do something. Fine. You might have, depending on your organization, maybe it's the developers are doing all the QA as well. But most teams, there's sort of a few people that are dedicated to test automation or even manual testing, and they'll make sure that basically it works as advertised, and then hopefully, finally, we deploy. Okay? Nothing I said should sound Well, my bet is what I just described is pretty close. Actually, looking at your nodding heads, looks like you recognize this. So this is what I see in the vast majority of companies. Most of you may recognize this is waterfall, right? Does everybody realize? Hopefully, if you're in this room, you recognize this is waterfall. The agile is, this much agile we're talking about, but we'll get to that. But this is, if this is how you work, and the truth is some companies will do bits and pieces of things that aren't quite as, I'm going to sort of paint a picture that's pretty binary, but it's a bit of a spectrum. But my guess is this is pretty close to how you work. And frankly, this is how teams have worked for a long time before. For 30 years, teams have basically worked this way. It's not like it's insane, but I'm going to absolutely argue it's incredibly ineffective. And this is the reason why so many of our efforts fail. So what I want to do now is get into the heart of this and talk about why is this so bad. So 10 key points. I honestly, I'm not exaggerating, can talk all day about why this is so bad. But I've just picked the 10 biggest reasons why this is so bad. So the first one is the source of the ideas themselves. So I described that in the typical process, the two main sources are the company executives or business owners, stakeholders, or customers. Now, the real issue is not that those two are terrible sources of ideas. I will say those are, generally speaking, our two least valuable sources of ideas. Okay, that's the truth. The biggest sources of ideas are not actually at the party. This is the bigger issue, the lost opportunity. Consistently, the best single source of ideas, it's your engineers. And they're not even in the picture. They're typically not ever in this room where these things are even debated. Now, the engineers, there's actually a really basic reason why the engineers are so often the best source of ideas. It's because they're working with the technology every day, and they're in the best possible position to see what's just now possible. Which is really, with product, what we're trying to do is match real customer need or pain with what's something that's just now technically possible. And that's sort of when the magic happens. And so to not include the engineers at the ideation, at the very earliest, is just a huge lost opportunity. And again, one of those really big differences between the best teams and most teams. That's just one source of ideas that's great. Another favorite source of ideas for me is data. People talk about being data-driven and stuff, but the data is typically not in the hands of the people doing the ideation in this old way. It's not the executives, maybe, they see data third hand, but they're not inside the data every day. Customers certainly are not. Of course, customers, remember, customers are awesome. We can talk a lot about how to really engage with customers, but what they're not good for is coming up with our product ideas. For two fundamental reasons. Number one, they don't know what's possible. And this is not their business. Their business is whatever they do. It's not to know what's technically possible. And number two, and this applies actually to all of us, not just our customers, but they don't know what they want until after they see it. This is fundamental truth about tech products. So anyway, the source of ideas in this way of working, you might occasionally include an engineer, or some idea might get passed up, but it's not institutionalized. It's almost the opposite is institutionalized. So the source of ideas is a fundamental problem in this way of working. Second big problem is this idea of business cases, the fallacy of business cases. I was trying to remember, Tom Chi had a great phrase that I wrote down, but of course I don't have it in front of me, but it was speaking to this point. Mark Andreessen, he has the phrase that's always stuck in my head about this, which is, in technology products, the most important thing is to know what you can't know. And I'll tell you, you can't know. This is the two things you can. Remember I said business case is based on two basic inputs. The first one is how much money you're going to make, and the second one is how much will it cost. You have no clue how much money you're going to make. You can make this up, and I've done that game for years too. I know how to play it, and I know how to get my stuff. I can, like Linda said, I could tell a good story and, selectively use the data, and we can all do business cases. Of course, we always get nervous that somebody's going to ask us 6 months from now how it worked out. But thankfully, they don't want to know either. They already know it's bad. It's true. So, but here, look, there's no way. Let's go through those one at a time. The first one, how much money are you going to make? You have no clue because it completely depends on how good your solution is. We don't even have a solution yet, so how do we know how good it's going to be? All we have is an idea. Somebody decided it's time to integrate with PayPal. And we can say, well, we're going to make 25 million more a year because we're going to integrate with PayPal. There's no way to know that until after you've actually integrated with PayPal and decided, or at least until you've run some smart tests to figure out how much that PayPal integration can actually get for you. Of course, the thing that people just love to skip over is there's a whole spectrum on how good a job you can do with any of these things on your roadmap, any of them. If you do a really crappy job, it will probably make nothing. And that's not a hyperbole. I mean, literally in an A/B test, we can quantify, we can attribute how much this thing helps or hurts, as the case may be. And very often, it is literally zero. Literally zero. It's one of the reasons I'm so pessimistic about features today. It's because so often, especially in a mobile context, don't assume a feature will actually contribute anything positive. It may just as well be a negative. But anyway, we don't know how much money it's going to make. Similarly, we don't know how much it's going to cost to build. You can go to your engineers, and most companies that use this silly process do. They go to their engineers and say, hey, we want to integrate PayPal. Or whatever, I shouldn't. And they say, and the engineers say, well, what does that mean? I mean, there's lots of ways. And are we talking about on all devices? And are we talking about in-app payments? And what are we talking about? They're like, we don't know that yet. We're just trying to decide if we should actually do it. And so they'll have this back and forth. And that's actually where T-shirt sizing came from. You guys have all heard the phrase, right? It just means, well, since you can't really tell us, is it small, medium, large, or extra large, we'll just compromise on that. Anyway, it's under the category I call corporate silliness. All right, so a lot of big companies do stuff like this. It's usually driven by some CFO that thinks they're bringing a level of sort of rationality to the process. But to be honest, in the terms of pick your battles, don't worry about it, because that's not the real problem anyway. Because no matter what, if you're doing a roadmap, you're going to have your items in some sort of priority. This is probably just as good a way of prioritizing as any other. The real issue is this roadmap. Roadmaps, and they are number one on my list of fundamental reasons why teams fail. Now, again, they come from two pretty reasonable requests. The leaders of the company want to know, are you working on the things that are most valuable, or at least that they think is the most valuable? And then they want some level of predictability in the business. Here's the problem, and I've long referred to this as the two inconvenient truths about product. And I honestly wish this was not the case, but I promise you this is the case. The first inconvenient truth about product is that at least half the items on your roadmap are never going to work with customers. Now, lots of possible reasons for that. And of course, what's hard about this is I can't tell you which items on the roadmap won't. We don't know until we kind of go through this long process. But in this way of working, we don't know. But most common reasons are we're all excited about it, and then we push it live, and our customers aren't so excited. You're Uber, and you think you've got a great feature for drivers, and you push it live in the app, and the drivers could care less. All you know is they're not using it. Sometimes they try to use it, but it's so complicated, and maybe they're driving along and they don't really actually want to go read a user manual for how to do this thing. And so they don't use it. They choose not to use it. It's too complicated for them. So it's the same problem. Sometimes actually never even gets that far, because what happens is, early on the developers were sort of pressed. They said, it shouldn't be more than a month to build. And then we get down into building, and the engineers actually get into this, and they realize, okay, this is a much more complicated thing than we thought, which is really, by the way, not their fault. Again, at this high level in this process, they were given almost nothing. And if they just come back and say everything's extra large, then nobody really goes along with that. So they might have said it was medium, and they learn out later that maybe it was large. And now, instead of being a month, it's closer to 3 months. And you say, or your executives say, no way is this justified 3 months. Forget it. Well, we've got plenty of other things we can do. So that's the first inconvenient truth, that at least half the ideas on our roadmap are not going to deliver the value we had hoped. The second inconvenient truth, which is sort of doubly depressing here, is that now for the half that could really have the potential to work, those are going to take several iterations, usually 3, 4, 5 iterations before it works well enough that it makes money. Well enough that it makes money. And that is frustrating in a lot of companies, because this is the process, and look at how long it takes just to cycle through once. If you need to be able to do that 3 or 4 times, in a startup, they usually run out of time and money, one or the other. They run out of runway. So that's their big issue. In a larger company, they don't usually run out of money or time. They run out of management patience. So then they say, look, guys, we talked about this 6 months ago. You've already done, you finally got it out. People aren't using it. And so many product teams complain to me that it's, they got one shot at something, one shot. And if they don't get it right, and they're, on one hand, they're pressured to treat it like an MVP, get out real fast. On the other hand, it's like, you've got one shot. And so, and this is how long it takes. So we have so much orphaned software. Now, some of that orphaned software was never going to be any good, and some of that orphaned software could have been good if they would have iterated. We say what matters is not time to market in our business, it's time to money. And we don't always charge for everything. It may just be a new feature that people aren't using, but the point is time until it's value, till it delivers that value. So those are the 2 inconvenient truths about product. The first one, we don't, at least half are not going to work as we had hoped with our customers, and the other is that it's going to take several iterations. Now, because of that, roadmaps are a serious problem. At Amazon, Jeff Bezos has one of my favorite quotes, which is, be stubborn on your vision, but flexible on your details. Roadmaps are the details, not the vision. And the problem with to be honest, the real problem with a roadmap, if all it was a list of ideas that you happen to think are in priority order, fine. That's not the issue, but that's not what a roadmap is in just about every company. In almost every company, if you put anything on a document labeled with the string roadmap, it's a commitment. That's the issue. And if it's a commitment, we're kind of locked in to delivering on these things, even though we know most of these are not going to pan out. This is why roadmaps are really so fundamentally at the heart of serious problems or product fail. Now, we have alternatives to all of these things. Mina's talk just now, she hinted at the main alternative to roadmaps. I'll go through that in a bit. But I want you to understand, I want you to realize why these roadmaps are such a problem. And in most of your companies, at least those of you more than, say, 100 people in your company, it's really compounded because you've got all these different business owners all kind of fighting over for their share of the roadmap, and it's a big negotiated mess. This is what's happening. Okay, but let's keep going, because that's just 3 fundamental problems. How about you guys? You know, the role of product manager has changed dramatically. Well, I should say, it's in the process still of changing. One of the reasons it's hindering that is that the people, literally you guys, are ahead of your organizations. So you can have a product person that's extremely strong, knows what to do, but they're in an organization working this way. It really hamstrings the whole movement. But let's talk about it. In this model, the role of product, what is it? Remember, I intentionally used the phrase gather requirements. This is how literally the job is described in many companies. Product manager gathers requirements from customers, from stakeholders, from different parts of the company, and documents them for engineering. Now, thank goodness we don't do a lot of PRDs anymore, or functional specs, but basically it just moved to Jira, it moved to use cases, it moved to what did I say there? To some form of annotations on your stories. And that's not the job. That is not the job of product. In fact, I would argue this role in this process is pretty much the antithesis of the modern role of product. So you're just we're often just backed into that. You know, one of the common problems we suffer in the product management community is so many product managers tell me they're essentially project managers. They are like the vast majority of their week is doing project management. And of course, it's kind of what this process is asking for. That's what you're sort of shepherding something through. In fact, if it wasn't a product company, that would literally be called project manager doing these things. They would gather up the requirements and make sure they're documented and and then move it through the process of design and build and test. So just suffice it to say here, this is not the role of product. This is not what we heard about today. Was describing a very different role for product and, by the way, for design, which is the next topic. But in this process of way of working, it's very difficult to actually apply the things we've been talking about today. All right, so that's number 4. Number 5 is this issue, the role of design. We heard today from different speakers that coming from the design community especially. And unfortunately, in this process, which again, I'm arguing the vast majority of companies are using, it's considered the lipstick on the pig model of design, right? At this point, it's just trying to, it's not a very fun job being a designer in this model. So those of you that work with a designer or might be a designer, it's tough because you're starting to work on something where a lot of bad decisions have already been made. They really are. Frankly, the product managers tell me the same thing in this model. They say, okay, another one of my favorite quotes. This is from John Doerr. He's for those that don't know, he's a major venture capitalist. He was the earliest VC behind Netscape, and he likes to say, we need teams of missionaries, not teams of mercenaries. This is really fundamental because this process is a mercenary process, which is why I was just about to say so many product managers come to me and say, yeah, this roadmap, it's ridiculous. These are not the right things. I know they're not the right things, but it's like above my pay grade. The executives went off in a room, or they went to a retreat, which they do once a quarter, and they come back and like, here's the roadmap. Aren't you happy? You know? Like, and they're like, you know what it really is we gave 20% to this business unit and 20% to this business unit, and it's just a joke. So the product managers know it's ridiculous. They still have to kind of write the stories for it. The designers know it's silly. They still have to kind of do the designs. And of course, the engineers, at this point, they're so cynical. They're like, you guys have no clue what you're doing. They're right, of course, about this, but it really is a mercenary process. And that is not what we want. I could go into more. Another little, maybe this is a little digression. I'm only sharing this because so much of the content today was actually about design more than product. And one of the reasons I'm sharing that, and that's it's one of my big passions is design. I love that, but I will say, in this process, because product managers aren't really set up to do the job of product management, what do? They play interaction designer. They create wireframes. I wonder, I won't embarrass people how many of you create wireframes and hand them to your designer, but I bet way too many of you would raise your hand. And that is, of course, now you imagine your designer and your product manager's giving you wireframes. At this point, you're probably, to be honest, in that setup, you're probably a visual designer, because an interaction designer is probably not going to want to work there. And that, of course, leads to other problems. So let me just say, if you're spending your time doing wireframes, well, you might be a truly gifted sort of unicorn product manager, interaction designer, and I love that, and contact me afterwards, because I know so many places that would love to hire you, but probably not. You probably are no better at interaction design as your engineers would be. And so you probably have, and if we look at your product, it's probably clear, because that's very, very easy to tell when it's not a trained interaction designer. So anyway, that's more of a digression. So that's the role of design is a problem. This is not why we hire our own UX team. To be honest, if this is the way your company insists on working, you might as well save the money and just use a visual design agency. Might as well. Because the reason we bring it in-house is so we don't work this way. All right. How about now the role of engineering? I've already shared some of the key points here, but because the engineers are not meant, we can't go along with just sort of keeping them as mercenaries sort of in the basement there to code. We say if you're just using your developers to code, you're only getting about half their value. This is a very big deal. Now, it doesn't mean every engineer wants to spend time face-to-face with customers and engage with the product issues, but some of them better or you're in big trouble. So we need some of them at least to engage heavily. Now, we can get in there. There's whole other issues around how test automation is handled, but in terms of a higher order issue, the problem here is developers are coming way too late, and they don't even know really the reasons. They don't have that understanding of the full context, and we're not getting the benefit of their understanding of the technology and what's possible. Now let's talk about the role of Agile, because if I had asked how many of you in the audience are in an Agile team, my bet is almost every hand would have come up. And while sort of that's true, what I've just described, this is not Agile. I mean, this is Agile in delivery a bit, but to be honest, in terms of Agile, this is like maybe a 10% of the value of Agile. And yet this is the vast majority of what so-called Agile organizations are actually doing. And to me, that's a huge shame because Agile is way more important than that. It should be used much more. We can't, well, again, that Amazon quote, stubborn on vision but flexible on details. This process is not at all flexible on those details. We need it to be flexible. So this is not what we in a product organization mean by Agile. All right. Totally different point, but huge one. And actually, Mina was hinting at this in her talk, or alluding to this. This is a project-centric process. That's actually where it came from. That in those big bureaucratic companies, especially in the old sort of IT world, where they would fund projects. They would fund and staff projects. Literally, we'd say, we are going to do an Android version of this, and you have to make a business case, and then you round up some engineers and designers in a product, and you go through this whole thing, and you launch it. That's output. It's not outcome. So what we want, and frankly, it's not hard to get output. We know how to get output. What's hard is to get results. This is the outcome point. So I forget the exact example that Mina was giving. I think it was in an Uber context. But for example, if our job is, let's say today it takes 30 days to take a new customer and get them live, the onboarding process. Many of your companies have some flavor of onboarding process. Let's say it takes 30 days. And that's not a problem really for an early startup where you can handhold a small number, but let's say, that's not a good long-term thing, and maybe that needs to get down to 30 minutes, which is totally not, if you automate a process like that, it's going to be on the order of 30 minutes, let's say. So your job in the product organization then, your job is to go from 30 days to 30 minutes. That might be, well, it's almost certainly not one release of one feature. It's probably a whole set of things. We are asked to solve that problem, get onboarding down to 30 minutes. That's our job. If we're a modern team using things like continuous discovery and continuous deployment, which I'm going to talk about, then that might be 50 iterations to do that over the course of maybe 3 weeks. But that's what matters. We don't get points for output. We get points for outcome. And that's a huge problem with this process. It's all about getting these projects launched. That's why it leads to these orphaned efforts. All right. Another huge issue, and this has always been really the big nail in the coffin for waterfall process, the actual feedback from customers happens at the very end. It's way too late. All the money, all the time. One of the things that I just can't even keep with a straight face anymore, I meet a lot of startups, and almost all of them love to brag to me about how they're following lean startup practices. And then I'd say, okay, that's great, but let's start. Show me how you work. They basically draw this. And I'm like, this is pretty much the opposite of lean startup. This is lean startup's all about what's the fastest, cheapest way to validate our ideas. This is the slowest, most expensive way we know how to validate our ideas. So how is this lean startup? I have no idea. This is nothing about that. It's way too little, way too late. You never have to do this. You can always do much better than this. All right. Thinking the time's going too fast. The biggest issue of all, though, is this notion of opportunity cost. Because what's going on here is that this way of working takes a lot of time, a lot of money, and in most companies, you can't get that back. It's gone. And opportunity cost really speaks to what you could have been doing instead of messing around like this. what you should have been doing. You know, there's a whole other dimension to this discussion that I haven't brought up. You know, I always don't want to use the word bubble. I don't want to jinx us, really, because it's been a pretty good run. Most of you would probably agree. But let's just agree it's frothy, right? It is a little wild right now. But one of the problems, I mean, this is not a little problem. With almost every team I work with cannot hire enough people. They literally can't staff all their teams. They have more money than job candidates. This is why, of course, you're seeing the changes to the salaries. And so it's really created it's a royal pain right now. Some of the big players in this industry are just paying outrageous prices to get people. And for those of you that are not Google or Facebook, it makes it really hard to staff your teams. So I mention all that, not that this is news to any of you, if you know this, but I mention that because it's caused a lot of teams to have to take a hard look at how can we do more with less people. And the first thing I tell them, well, stop working like this, because this is costing you a huge amount of wasted opportunity. Okay, so I would argue those are the 10 biggest problems with that way of working. Now, I just have a few minutes, but I want to give you a taste. So the best teams, first of all, the best teams do not work anything like what I just described. And maybe you can come up with a better explanation than I can about why it's so different. But it is different, and what I want to do is give you a taste of what that means. Now, there's a lot of ways I can mention. I've written lots of articles and blog posts, as have others, about how this other way of working. But I want to give you a taste of what's important. So first of all, there are still ideas, but now we have many more sources of ideas, starting with developers. And the idea, let me just show more of this here. The idea, it goes by different names. I refer to it as continuous discovery and continuous delivery. But the idea here is that discovery is really what all product people do. It's what lean startup techniques are about. It's about what customer development techniques are about. It's how do we come up with good product to build. If you're in this room, that's what you're responsible for, coming up with good stuff to build. Discovery, though, says, look, building it, QA it, launching it, that is the worst way to do this. Way too slow, way too expensive. We have to do better than that. I absolutely loved Tom Chee's talk this morning. If any of you missed that talk, you've got to watch it online. His talk, because that's an example. He was describing the techniques that he uses for product discovery. And by the way, if you didn't catch this, he was describing for hardware-software kinds of products, which are even harder to do discovery on than software only, which is most of us. But the idea is we use those techniques to quickly separate the good ideas from the bad and to quickly iterate to a good solution, and then we deliver. Deliver means building production quality software. So you heard that theme come out earlier today too, between where one discussion was around how do we figure out the right product and the other was about scale. That's the same concept, just sort of shown a little different way. Now, just in terms of language, there are so many ideas, of course, and I will tell you, good teams try out many more ideas than most teams. In other words, if you're a typical team, this completely depends on the size of your organization. But let's say you're doing 100 ideas a quarter on a roadmap and getting those launched a quarter, you should be doing on the order of 500 ideas in discovery and still only delivering that 100. But now you're delivering the 100 where you have evidence it's going to work. Okay? So we use vision and we use one system is OKR system, objective and key results. The OKR system is really the alternative to roadmaps. Now, it's not the only alternative. It is my favorite alternative. It's what Google and Facebook and LinkedIn have kind of run their business on for a decade. But if you want to know, well, what's the alternative to roadmaps, start there. And anyway, we use the vision, which says, of course, where we're trying to go over the next several years, the OKRs, which are telling us what to work on this quarter, what problems to solve, not the solution. And then our job, product teams, and I should say, Discovery is product managers, designers, UX designers, that's interaction visual, and engineers. We're working side by side in a truly collaborative fashion to come up with good solutions to these problems. And once we have that evidence. Now, let me just make a couple other points. The main way we do that is we run these MVP tests. This is really what an MVP is. A lot of people go sideways on this because they take MVP too literally. It's not a product. A product is something you can scale and run a business on. This is an experiment. It's a test. So we run these MVP tests in Discovery, and the idea is to get to product market fit. Again, those are the two most important concepts in product, MVP testing and product market fit. Now, when we're doing Discovery, I hope it's okay, Martin, I'm going to go a few seconds over, but when we're in product discovery, there's really we need to first of all make sure whatever we're doing is valuable. If it's not valuable, it's not usable to anybody. It's not important for anybody. It also needs to be usable. So valuable is like, would they buy it or would they choose to use it? Usable is, could they use it? Feasible, which is really two things. Feasible is, can we build it, and can our stakeholders support it? These are the three key areas we're trying to answer in Discovery. I'm going to take the opportunity, because it's a rare moment to be able to get in front of you guys, this group, and I'm going to say this, and I hope I don't come across as sanctimonious. I really don't want to. But I will tell you something I care a lot about, and with the teams that I work with. The truth is, and you heard people were alluding to this through the day, a lot of teams now are quite good, and they can, you heard this notion of, we can actually create a pretty addictive solution, application, mobile app, service. And so the point I'd like to raise is I'm trying to encourage more teams to add one more consideration to the discussion, which is really, should we build it? It's really the ethical question. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm preaching, and I know that there are definitely a lot of CEOs in this valley that have absolutely zero interest in that fourth question. But I think it's important, and the truth is, I think this group, most everybody I know in product is truly passionate about products, and so you do care about this. You really are trying to change the world in a good way, and I am suggesting that in Discovery, we also consider ethics. That's maybe a whole other discussion. Okay, but that's maybe a taste. Good teams are working this way. In Discovery, they're actually trying between 10, 20 iterations per week. Okay, that's not one iteration every 2 weeks, which is typical Scrum in delivery, but this is many iterations a day. And each iteration is, like Tom Chi was describing it, as learning or insights. They're all about learning. We have quantitative techniques in Discovery and qualitative techniques in Discovery. But it's all about quickly getting that evidence, separating the good ideas from the bad, and making sure our developers are spending most of their time building production, building the stuff we have evidence is going to move the needle. That's the difference. All right. So I think I probably threw enough at you there. I know I threw a lot at you there, but I just wanted to take advantage of the opportunity. I really do hope this was useful. My email's right there. Anybody if you have a question after, feel free to contact me. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.